They were already saying he would smother before the snow flew, and the man was greasing a hole in the ground like it was a candle. In the summer of 1882, near a hard little settlement called Wick Hollow out on the Montana plains, Ephraim Dunmore spent the warm months down in a pit. Not building a cabin where a cabin should be, though. He cut a low room down into the face of a south-facing bank the way a few of the poorer homesteaders did, and then, instead of leaving the dirt walls bare like every dugout in the territory, he melted kettle after kettle of beef tallow and beeswax and rubbed the hot grease into the raw earth of his walls and his floor and his low plank ceiling, coat over coat, day after day, until the whole hollow was sheathed inside in a smooth waxen rind. The whole hollow laughed. Winter was coming the way it always came to that country, mean and early and long, and every other homesteader for 20 miles was chinking a log cabin tight or squaring off an honest dirt dugout. And here was Ephraim Dunmore smearing a pit full of candle fat, greasing a grave, like a chandler too broke and too broken to build a real house. He would smother in his own tallow reek or freeze in the wet dirt by the first hard blow, they said, buried in a hole he had greased like a mold. What none of them knew, and what the killing winter would teach them, was that Ephraim Dunmore had read the cold and the ground better than any man in Wick Hollow, and had sealed into that greased hollow the one thing that would hold. He had come to that country carrying more grief than goods. He had been a beekeeper and a tallow chandler back in the settled country to the east, a lean, close-mouthed man who had spent his working life among wax and rendered fat and the patient warm work of the hive, and who knew grease and its ways the way another man knows leather or iron. He had worked the bees with his brother, the two of them raising honey and casting candles and living quiet, and the year before, in a dry and evil autumn, a prairie fire had come over the grass faster than a horse could run, and had taken the apiary and the sheds and the wax house, and had taken his brother, who had gone back for the kettles, all in a single roaring afternoon. Something in Ephraim Dunmore went quiet after that, and did not come loud again. He loaded a wagon with what the fire had left him, his molds and his rendering kettles and a few tools, and went west, as far from the burned ground as a man could get, and came on to a cheap quarter section at Wick Hollow in the Montana Territory in May with an ox, a dog that followed the wagon, and a way of thinking about walls and grease and the ground that no other homesteader in the hollow would ever have guessed. For Ephraim Dunmore had spent his whole working life learning two plain facts that the whole of his strange house would be built upon, and the settlers around him knew neither. The first was about the ground. A chandler and a beekeeper works close to the earth and marks how it behaves, and Ephraim had marked long ago that the deep ground does not freeze the way the air does, that a foot or two down the dirt stays mild and even the whole year round, cool in the summer heat, and, more to the point, warm against the winter, holding a slow, steady heat all through the killing months that a cellar keeper trusts his potatoes to. A room cut down into that deep ground was a room wrapped on every side in a great slow warmth the winter could not quickly reach. That much a few of the dugout builders half knew. But the second fact, the one that was his alone, was about the dirt itself, and it was this, that raw earth breathes and raw earth weeps. Bare dirt is porous, full of tiny passages, and the dry killing wind of a plains winter worms straight in through the soil of an open dugout and strips the ground's warmth away as fast as it rises, and the ground damp wicks straight through the same soil and weeps down the walls and soaks a dugout cold and wet and miserable. The deep ground gave the warmth for free. The trouble was keeping it, and keeping the wet and the wind out of the dirt, and no bare dugout on the plains could do it. And Ephraim Dunmore, who had spent a lifetime sealing things with wax, knew exactly how to do it. For that is what wax and tallow are, a seal against air and against water both. A wax seal on a jar of honey keeps the air out so the honey never turns. A tallow coat rubbed into leather or a boot keeps the wet from soaking through. A sealed calm holds its store for a year and never weeps. Grease closes the little passages in a porous thing so that neither air nor water can pass. And it came to Ephraim in the long quiet after the fire, that if he cut his room down into the warm, deep ground, and then worked a skin of tallow and beeswax into every inch of the raw dirt walls, he would have the ground's free warmth on every side, and a sealed rind holding it in, a wall the dry wind could not breathe through, and the damp could not weep through. So the cold could not strip the warmth away, and the wet could not soak it out. The earth would give the heat, the wax would keep it. Where the plain dugout men let the wind and the water walk straight through their bare dirt walls and carry the ground's warmth off into the winter, Ephraim Dunmore meant to close the dirt with grease and shut the warmth in. It was, though he had never heard the words and never would, a sealed earth shelter, a waxed and airtight dugout. And he set out that May to build one in the side of a Montana bank. He began, to the Hollow's mild approval, by cutting a dugout that looked at first like any other. Through May and into June, Ephraim Dunmore dug his low room back into the south bank, squaring the walls and the floor, setting a low ridge of poles and plank for a ceiling with the earth heaped back over it, framing a low doorway to the south where the winter sun would find it, and the homesteaders who rode by nodded to see it, for a bank dugout at least was sensible and cheap. Then he did the thing that turned the nods to laughter. Instead of moving into the finished pit and calling it done like a sane man, he set up his rendering kettles in the yard and began to melt tallow and beeswax by the bucket, and to carry it steaming down into the hollow and work it into the walls. When a neighbor asked him what in the world he was doing greasing a dirt room, Ephraim said only that bare dirt breathes and weeps, and greased dirt does neither. Which was true, and the neighbor rode off shaking his head at a man who thought a wall of mud wanted buttering like a pan. All through June and into July he greased his hollow, melting the tallow and the wax together over a slow fire, brushing and rubbing it hot into the raw earth so it soaked in and set hard, laying coat over coat on the walls and the floor and up into the plank of the low ceiling, working the grease into every crack and seam until the whole inside of the pit took on a smooth, sealed, waxen skin. His plain dugout became a greased one, and the laughter grew with every kettle. The work of it was long and strange and stinking, and it made the mockery worse, because from the road it looked like nothing but a broken man rubbing candle fat into a grave. Rendering tallow and boiling wax through the hot months is close, reeking labor, and Ephraim did it in the broad heat of the summer, the grease smoke hanging over his yard so that folks a mile off knew what the chandler was about. And all the while the sensible thing lay right there in plain sight. Move into the honest dry pit and be done, the way every dugout family did, and Ephraim Dunmore turned his back on the easy finish every day to melt another kettle and rub another coat of grease into the dirt. A man who rode by once asked whether he did not know that everybody's dugout wept a little and smelled of earth, and that was just the price of a cheap roof. And Ephraim Dunmore said that a wet dugout was a cold dugout, and a breathing dugout was a colder one, that the wet and the wind were the whole enemy, and the grease shut them both out. And the man rode off certain the chandler had lost his reason along with his bees. Ephraim Dunmore knew exactly why he greased every inch of that hollow, and there was not another soul in Wick Hollow who could have told you. The laughter had a leader, and his name was Barnabas Skeer. Skeer was a sod-buster grown prosperous, a big, loud, broad-handed man who ran the most ground of anyone near the hollow, held the big double-log claim house up on the flat, and liked everyone to know that a man got on in this world by doing the plain thing well and wasting nothing. He had watched Ephraim Dunmore cut an honest dugout and grunted his approval. Then he had watched the man spend a whole summer smearing it inside with candle grease, and something in Barnabas Skeer took it as a personal affront, as if the broken chandler were making a mock of honest homesteading itself. So Skeer led the laughter, and he did it with a sod-buster's carrying voice. He would stand at his big claim house and watch the grease smoke rise from Dunmore's yard, and remark that here was a man so addled he had buttered a badger hole and called it a home, that Dunmore had greased himself a grave and would lie down in it come January slick as a tallow candle, that a wall of dirt smeared with fat would keep out the cold about as well as a greased boot keeps out a river. And the men would laugh, and Skeer would say the good Lord gave a man logs and sod to build with, not a chandler's kettle to butter a hole in the ground. It went around the country. Ephraim Dunmore, the man with the greased grave, too broke and too broken to build a proper house, who had smeared a pit with candle fat and would smother in the reek of it. Ephraim let them talk, because a laughing settlement is a settlement that leaves a man alone to work, and the work was long. When his walls and floor and ceiling were greased and sealed, he turned to the parts that no one watching understood at all, because they were the parts that made the seal whole. He hung his low door double, an outer leaf and an inner leaf of plank, with a still, sealed space between them, both edges packed and greased so no draught could work around them, a little airtight lock a man passed through coming in from the cold. He greased and fitted the frame of his one small south window tight, a double pane with the gap between them sealed, set low to catch the winter sun, and let in the light, without letting in the wind. He worked a lip of packed, greased earth around the base of every wall where the floor met it, closing the last seams where the damp likes to creep. He set a single small iron stove against the back wall, its pipe carried up and out through a close greased collar and laid in a modest rank of dry wood beside it, nothing like the great cords the other men were splitting against the season. For his whole design was built to run on almost no fuel, and he knew it. The men who watched him seal up the last cracks of a greased hole in the ground were sure now that grief had finished what the fire began. Barnabas Skeer told it at the settlement that the chandler had corked himself up in a grease pot like a fly in amber and would stew in his own fat come January. And folks rode past on Sundays just to look at the queer greased dugout where a fool had buttered the dirt. What they were looking at and could not see was the finest part of the whole design. Every honest dugout in that country breathed the dry wind straight in through its bare dirt walls and wept the ground damp straight down them, and lost the deep ground's free warmth to both. Every chinked log cabin bled its warmth out through the solid wood and the chinking to the wind. Ephraim Dunmore's sealed earth shelter did neither. The deep warm ground stood all around it, giving it slow, steady heat. The smooth, waxen rind held that heat in and shut the killing wind and the soaking wet out of the dirt. And the little stove had almost nothing left to do but warm the air a man breathed. He had cut his room into the one warmth the winter could not reach and sealed it in with a lifetime's knowledge of wax, and left the cold no way through the dirt at all. It was as complete a piece of cold country reasoning as the territory had ever seen worked into a bank, and the whole of Wick Hollow rode past on Sundays to laugh at it. By the middle of November, the country began to turn hard, and Ephraim Dunmore got his first real proof, though he was near the only man who marked it. A savage norther came down off the plains one night, the first true one of the season, the wind out of the north with a dry edge on it that drove straight into everything it could enter, and behind it a wet raw cold that soaked into the ground. In the gray of the morning, the dugout families up and down the hollow woke to misery. The dry wind had worked in through their bare dirt walls all night and stripped the warmth out, so their pits were bitter cold, though the deep ground below should have held them, and the raw damp had wept in through the same porous dirt and run down the walls in cold, dark streaks, soaking the earth so the whole dugout smelled of wet grave and every surface was clammy to the touch. That was the plain price of bare dirt, and every dugout family in the territory paid it. Ephraim Dunmore did not. He rose in his greased hollow and laid a bare palm flat against the waxed wall, the thing a chandler does by habit to feel where a seal has failed, and the wall was dry as a sealed jar and smooth under his hand and barely cool. The grease holding the wind out of the dirt and the damp out of the room, the deep ground's warmth held snug behind the sealed rind. He did not smile much, Ephraim Dunmore, not since the autumn the fire took his brother, but he smiled at that. His neighbor's walls were weeping cold mud. His own were dry and mild and sealed. It was working. There is a particular loneliness in being the only man in a country who believes a true thing, and Ephraim Dunmore had lived in it all that summer, doubled now by the other loneliness he carried out of the fire. On the hard, clear nights of that late autumn, with the first proof behind him and the great test still ahead, he would sit in the snug-greased hollow with a little stove banked to almost nothing and go back over the whole of it in his mind, the way a man checks a sum he has staked his life on. There was no book for what he had built. He had only what he had learned with his own hands in a lifetime of wax and rendered fat and quiet ground. The plain remembered facts that the deep earth holds its warmth and that grease seals a porous thing against air and water both. And on the cold nights, those facts were the only voice in the whole of Wick Hollow that agreed with him. Everyone he could speak to believed the loud and obvious thing, that a man keeps warm behind good logs and a roaring fire, and that Ephraim Dunmore had greased himself a grave. The quiet thing about the warm, deep ground and the sealed waxen skin, only he believed. He had decided long before which of the two he would trust when they disagreed, and he trusted it now, and put another small stick on the coals and slept warm and dry while the frost cracked the ground outside. He told no one, because there was no one who would have believed him, and besides, Ephraim Dunmore did not need the settlement to agree with him before a thing was true. He greased a small lean to shelter into the bank beside the door for his ox so it too might break the wind. Kept close by him the shaggy dog that had followed his wagon west and settled in to wait for the winter he had spent 6 months getting ready for. The hollow settled in too, its wood piles high, its opinion of Ephraim Dunmore fixed. He was the broken chandler with the greased grave who had smeared a pit with candle fat. And when the first killing cold came, they expected, in the way people expect such things without quite wishing them, to find him frozen or smothered in the greased hole he had dug himself. The first killing cold came in the second week of December, and it did not come alone. It came as the front edge of the worst winter that country had seen in the memory of anyone living in it. A winter men in Montana would still be measuring other winters against 40 years on. It began with a wind out of the northwest that dropped the temperature 50 degrees between noon and dark, and then it began to snow, and the snow did not stop. For 9 days the blizzard held the territory in its fist. The wind blew without pause, packing the snow into drifts that swallowed fences and buried the low sheds and cut Wick Hollow off from everything but its own hard endurance. Cattle drifted before the wind and died against the drift lines by the score. A freight road that Barnabas Skeer's own teams had worn into the flat vanished as if it had never been. The thermometer nailed to the wall of the settlement store, which the storekeeper watched with a kind of horror, fell and did not come back. It passed 20 below, it passed 30 below, it passed 40, it passed 50. On the 5th day of the storm, in the blue dark of a morning when the wind seemed to reach down into the marrow of the world, the storekeeper wiped the frost from the glass and read it at 59 degrees below zero, and he had never in his life seen it there. And he did not tell the few who were about because he did not think a number like that would help anyone bear it. 59 below. At such a cold, the ordinary rules of a frontier winter stopped applying, and a new and merciless arithmetic took over. Breath froze in a man's beard the instant it left him. Dry wood burned with a thin, hurrying flame that seemed to give no heat at all against a cold that vast. The homesteaders of Wick Hollow, who had built their honest, chinked cabins and their plain, bare dugouts like sensible people, found now what sensible people found in a winter like that one, that the dry wind at 59 below drove through every bare dirt wall and every log chink and stripped a room cold no matter how the stove roared. And that the deep warmth the ground itself would have given them ran straight out through their breathing, weeping walls and was lost to the wind. They kept their fires roaring and wore their coats indoors and watched their great wood piles shrink with a growing private fear, and the storm did not stop, and the thermometer did not rise, and the wood burned down. In the bank, in the queer grease dugout the whole country had laughed at, Ephraim Dunmore was warm. He was not roasting, the low-buried room was not hot, but it was warm, steadily and quietly and unmistakably warm, and it stayed warm through the first day of the storm and the second and the third with almost no fire at all. For the deep ground around his sealed hollow was doing precisely the work he had built it to do. The warm earth stood on every side of him, below the reach of the killing frost, giving up its slow, steady heat into the room. The smooth, waxen rind held that heat in and shut the shrieking dry wind out of the dirt so it could not strip the warmth away, and shut the damp out so it could not soak the walls, and between the free warmth of the ground and the seal of the grease, the little stove had almost nothing left to do. The wind that stripped the bare dugouts of their heat could find nothing of Ephraim's warmth to strip, for his warmth was sealed behind a waxed wall the wind could not breathe through. He burned in a day what the men above burned in an hour, and the deep ground kept the room mild on the third day of the storm as steadily as it had on the first. The storm gave him no reason to trust it, and every reason to doubt, and still the greased hollow held. The wind found the open plain and threw itself at the buried bank without pause. A solid pouring roar that went on so long, the ear stopped hearing it as sound and began to feel it as pressure, and the snow drove so deep over the low roof that it packed a thick blanket of white over the whole hollow that only sealed the warmth in the better. Ephraim Dunmore went out twice a day into that killing white, through the little greased airlock of his double door, to see to his ox in the bank lean to and break the drift back from the doorway, and each time the cold took the breath out of him like a blow and drove him back in within minutes, and each time he came back down into a room that was simply, quietly warm and dry. The sealed earth holding the cold off as steadily on the 5th day as it had on the 1st. He fed the stove a stick when he thought of it, more from habit than need, and the deep ground and the waxed rind did the true work, while the world above went to a cold no roaring fire could have beaten through a breathing wall. He lay down at night with the dog against him, and the storm screaming over the buried roof through a foot of snow and a foot of sealed earth, and he was warm. And the wind could not get at the warmth, and hour after hour, day after day, the greased hollow did not fail. He had a thermometer of his own, a small one he had carried out of the settled country and hung by the inner door, and on the 5th morning of the storm, the morning the store glass read 59 below, Ephraim Dunmore rose in the blue dark and stirred his little stove and looked at it. The needle inside his greased hollow stood at 44 degrees above zero. 44. Not warm as a summer parlor is warm, but warm as a good cellar is warm on a hard night. Warm enough that his hands were sure, and his water stood liquid in the pail, and his dog slept stretched flat on the dry greased floor with no thought of cold at all. 44 degrees inside, against 59 below outside, a gulf of more than 100 degrees held across a sealed skin of grease and a wrapping of deep warm earth by one small fire in the worst blizzard the territory had ever thrown. Ephraim Dunmore stood a while looking at the needle, and then he laid the flat of his hand against the waxed wall the way he had that first frosty morning. And the sealed dirt was dry and mild under his palm, while astride beyond it the frozen crust of the plain stood at a cold that would kill a man in an hour, and he put another small stick on the coals and let the storm scream, because the deep ground and the greased rind were doing the killing cold no favors, and the room was warm and dry, and it was working exactly, as he had known 6 months before that it would. Up on the flat, the reckoning had come to Barnabas Skeer. Skeer had cordwood, a great deal of it, and he had burned through the better part in 7 days of trying to hold his big double-log claim house against the cold, for a great drafty room of logs and chinking takes a great deal of feeding, and on the 8th day, with the storm still howling and the wood run low and his stove for the first time going gray and cold at its heart, the loud, broad-handed man who had led all the laughing understood that he was in real danger, and that the nearest help in that white and screaming world was in the greased hole he had mocked. It cost him something to go. He waited until the cold in his own big rooms had a killing edge to it, and then he wrapped himself in every hide he owned, and put his head down into the wind, and fought his way down off the flat and across the buried hollow to the chandler's queer greased dugout, half frozen, not sure the man would even answer, not sure a man could even be alive in a hole folks said was mostly grease and grief. He beat on the outer door with a numb fist, and it opened, and he stepped down into the little greased lock between the two doors, and then the inner door opened, and warmth rolled up out of the buried hollow into the storm like something solid. Skeer stood in the low doorway and could not speak at first, and it was not only the cold that stopped his mouth. He stepped down onto the dry greased floor of Ephraim Dunmore's buried room and felt the warmth of it stand steady all around him. A living heat with no roaring stove anywhere in it, only a small fire banked low against the back wall, and he laid his own numb hand against the smooth waxen wall from long habit and found it dry and mild, and looked at the dog asleep and stretched flat on the warm floor, and at the rendering kettles and the pale candle molds ranked quiet on their shelf, and at the little thermometer by the door reading 44 degrees while the world outside stood at 59 below, and Barnabas Skeer, sod-buster, owner of the big double-log claim house, leader of all the mockery, understood at last what he had been laughing at all summer long. He was quiet a moment. Then he took off his frozen cap and said the only thing there was to say. You put the warm ground on every side and sealed it in with grease, he said, slow, and it held. Ephraim Dunmore said that it had. Skeer stood there a while longer with the thawing coming painful into his hands and said, lower, that he had been a fool about the greased grave and about the man, and had said hard things he had no business saying. Ephraim Dunmore, who had no more gloating in him than he had left of grief to spare, only told him to shut the inner door and sit by the stove and stop letting the warm out. He kept Barnabas Skeer through the last day of the storm, and two others from the hollow who came down the buried road behind Skeer once word of the warm greased dugout went round, and the small buried room built to hold one man and a dog held 4 men and the dog besides, and it stayed warm through all of it on almost no wood. Because the heat was not in the fire, the heat was in the deep ground held sealed behind a skin of wax the cold could not cross. When the wind finally broke on the 10th day and the sun came up hard and blinding over a white and ruined country, the men who came up out of Ephraim Dunmore's greased hollow walked out warm and whole into a hollow that had lost cattle and sheds and very nearly some of its people, and they did not laugh about the greased fool's grave any more. Barnabas Skeer least of all. He went home to his cold, big claim house and his burned-out woodpile a changed man, and in the spring, quietly, he came down to the dugout and asked Ephraim Dunmore to show him how the walls were sealed, and Ephraim Dunmore showed him. Word of the warm hollow got around the country the way the laughter once had, only slower and more careful. Men rode over that next summer to see the greased walls and the double door and the low room that had held 44 while the plain stood at 59 below, and Ephraim Dunmore, who had never much minded being laughed at, did not much mind being asked either, and he showed them the room cut down into the warm deep ground and the smooth waxen rind worked into the dirt on every side, and told them, in his short way, the thing he had known since the first calm he ever sealed, that the earth a man digs into keeps a warmth the winter cannot reach, and that grease shuts out the wind and the wet that would carry it off, so that a hand's thickness of waxed dirt a man cannot see through will beat a foot of proud chinked log. A few greased their dugouts like his. Most did not, because it was long, hard, reeking work, and most men would rather raise one proud wall of logs they could point to than smear a hole with candle fat they had to take on faith, but the ones who sealed them blessed them. And the story of the winter of 1882, the winter of 59 below, when the broken chandler in the greased grave stayed warm and the men who laughed came knocking, was told in Wick Hollow for as long as there was a Wick Hollow to tell it, They had called him a fool for greasing a hole in the ground while wiser men raised honest walls of log and sod, and in a way the wiser men had looked the wiser, right up until the cold asked its real question. For a hard winter does not care how proud a wall stands or how high its woodpile is stacked. It asks only whether the idea will hold when the temperature falls far enough, and most ideas will not. Ephraim Dunmore had spent a whole summer answering that question before it was ever asked, cutting his room down into the one warmth the winter could not reach and sealing it in with a lifetime's knowledge of wax so the cold could find no way through the dirt at all. And when the killing winter came and asked, his answer was already made, and it was warm and it held. As the old chandlers used to say of the sealed calm that holds its store whole and sweet through a year, while the open crock spoils and weeps, it is not the honey that keeps, but the wax that seals it. Ephraim Dunmore had sealed his home the way he had sealed 1,000 combs. And on the morning it fell to 59 below, the smooth waxen skin of it never once let the cold come in.